New images and some pretty horrifying tales of life on board that stranded vacation cruise ship.
The largest cruise ship to ever dock in the city of Mobile at that cruise ship terminal.
Dude, it's gonna be on that boat right there. It ain't gonna stop there.
He's got it wound out too.
Oh yeah, cuz he's turning. It's over with, cuz.
It's funny to see it in slow motion now.
They dropping that other anchor. Dude, it's too late, man. You should have dropped that son of a bitch a long time ago. Oh, we couldn't see it. Oh, shit.
It was supposed to be a dream vacation, a 4-day cruise through the Gulf of Mexico aboard the Carnival Triumph. Sunshine, luxury, endless buffets, and warm waters. But just 2 days in, the dream turned into a nightmare. A fire in the engine room knocked out power. Air conditioning failed, toilets stopped working, and the more than 3,000 people on board were left adrift in what passengers would soon call the poop cruise. This is the story of how a floating luxury resort became a floating disaster zone, and how one incident would raise serious questions about cruise safety, corporate negligence, and the dark side of the cruise industry.
I'm glad I'm glad I have toilets. The toilet situation was pretty bad. They told us to go in showers. The boat started tilting, so you couldn't really do that anymore because of the drain. So they told us to go in sinks, and they handed out bags for us. At first, the first couple days, everyone was hoarding. People would take the little mini cereal boxes, piling like 20, stuffing them down their shirts. People grabbing cake with bare hands, and when they had hamburgers, they'd take about 8 piled high on a plate, and so the food situation was kind of pretty frustrating. As little kids, I was so glad I didn't have my kids there. I felt so bad for people that have to wait in line with them. People were sleeping in hallways and stairwells. We were sleeping by the lifeboats. Old people were just stuck by the stairs in their wheelchairs. People had to bring food down for them. It was really sad.
Land has never felt so great. But we are incredibly grateful for a crew that served us in such unselfish ways, doing things that are unthinkable, and they were just so kind-hearted and with smiles the entire time.
No one can ever prepare for the kind of situation, whether it's the captain or the crew members or the patrons on board. So I don't care what Carnival line it was or what company it was. When your engine is on fire, there's nothing they can do, and they handled it with the utmost respect for us and care for us. And of course, it was terrifying and horrible in a lot of ways, but the goodness that needs to be recorded in this situation is just exactly what she said about the crew.
On the morning of February 7th, 2013, excitement buzzed through the port of Galveston, Texas. Over 3,100 passengers eagerly filed onto the towering Carnival Triumph, joined by more than 1,000 crew members. For many, it was the beginning of a much-anticipated vacation, an escape from winter, work, and everyday worries. Families, honeymooners, retirees, and groups of friends posed for photos on the gangway, their smiles wide with anticipation. The Carnival Triumph was no ordinary vessel. Stretching 893 feet in length and weighing over 100,000 tons, she was a floating colossus, a marvel of modern engineering and hospitality. On board, the ship boasted multiple swimming pools and hot tubs, a state-of-the-art spa and fitness center, several bars and lounges, Broadway-style entertainment, and a variety of restaurants serving everything from burgers to fine dining. There was even a casino and a jogging track, offering guests a little slice of Las Vegas and wellness combined, all on the open sea. To many passengers, the ship felt more like a self-contained resort than a mode of transportation. The itinerary was simple but enticing, a 4-day round-trip cruise to Cozumel, Mexico, and back. Just enough time to soak up the sun, sip a few cocktails, and enjoy the floating paradise without ever worrying about the world back home. The Gulf of Mexico shimmered beneath the February sky, and the forecast promised warm weather and calm waters. Everything was perfectly aligned for the getaway of a lifetime. As the Triumph pulled away from the dock and began her voyage through the Gulf, spirits were high. Music echoed across the decks. Guests danced at the sail-away party with frozen drinks in hand. Children raced toward the water slides while couples found lounge chairs to bask in the sun. The crew, dressed in crisp uniforms and trained in top-tier hospitality, bustled about with professional efficiency, ensuring every need was met and every drink was topped off. Behind the scenes, however, things weren't quite as perfect. Cruise ships, no matter how luxurious, are highly complex machines dependent on thousands of interlocking systems: engines, plumbing, power, refrigeration, waste management. Any disruption in these systems can trigger a cascade of problems, especially in the middle of the ocean. But for now, no one was thinking about that. Not the passengers, nor most of the crew. After all, Carnival was a trusted name in cruising. The Triumph had completed hundreds of voyages. What could possibly go wrong? The first full day at sea passed without incident. Passengers explored the ship, lounged by the pools, and indulged in all-you-can-eat buffets. The staff kept everything running smoothly, from towel service to salsa dance lessons. Some guests tried their luck at the blackjack tables, while others booked shore excursions in Cozumel, snorkeling trips, beach breaks, tequila tastings. The cruise was going exactly as planned, but the illusion of control was fragile. Beneath the surface of all that luxury, past the fancy dinners and bingo games, was a network of engineering that held the entire operation together. And on the second night of the cruise, something began to go terribly wrong.
And this is our cruise ship on fire. And we're on the 9th floor. And we might be jumping off of
Carnival
it.
Triumph, February 7th through the 11th.
Folks, we hit an iceberg.
At first, it was just a slight vibration, nothing alarming, just something a few passengers felt underfoot. Some ignored it. Others joked that it was just part of the ride. But deep in the engine room, a crisis was beginning to unfold. A fire had broken out in one of the ship's aft engine rooms. Though it was quickly extinguished by the automatic suppression system and no one was injured, the damage had already been done. The fire had disabled key electrical systems, cutting power to the engines and leaving the ship adrift, powerless, and increasingly vulnerable. From that moment forward, the Carnival Triumph would no longer be a pleasure cruise. It would become a maritime nightmare.
tonight after days trapped at sea on that Carnival cruise ship Triumph. The real triumph, though, those passengers simply getting through it all, the so-called cruise from hell, finally docking in Alabama, 5 days after a terrifying engine fire knocked out power and turned that ship into what some called a floating petri dish. There was suffering, fortunately not the casualties of last year's Costa Concordia, but all of it does raise serious questions. And so tonight here, we put a microscope on the industry as a whole. Why was an ultimate rescue so late in coming? And were the apologies too little, too late?
Passengers still didn't fully understand what had happened. Crew members made announcements about technical difficulties and reassured everyone that engineers were working on it. For a while, people believed it was just a minor hiccup. Maybe the ship would be delayed a bit. Maybe they'd miss a port. Inconvenient, but not disastrous. But then the lights started flickering.
It started out, we had one tugboat, and it was just a little one. Apparently it came from Mexico. And then we got a second one, it was a large one, and they were both in the front. Well, the cable snapped on the smaller one. And the large one has been tugging us ever since, and the smaller one disappeared, and I've been told that it's in the back of the ship. And that's all that I've been told. Well, I found it. There she is, the dub hole. She's tied on. And it looks like the boat's going that way. This one is keeping us straight.
I just have some crew members down there holding it.
Hang on.
I know why the rope keeps breaking. He probably bought it 100 years ago.
From Mexico.
Air conditioning systems began shutting down. Elevators stopped working, and soon the toilets did too. Reality was setting in. The Carnival Triumph wasn't just experiencing technical issues, it had lost propulsion and was effectively dead in the water. The mighty vessel, once a palace of luxury, was now at the mercy of the ocean, floating aimlessly more than 150 miles from the nearest port. The glamorous cruise had turned into something else entirely. From the outside, the ship still looked imposing, gleaming in the sun. But inside, conditions were deteriorating fast. Without engine power, the ship couldn't process sewage, refrigerate food, or provide adequate air circulation. Emergency generators could only do so much. By the end of that second day, the Carnival Triumph had begun its slow transformation from a floating resort to what some passengers would later describe as a hell ship. And yet, this was only the beginning.
Here on the Lido deck, and this is the open deck where a lot of people slept for the last 2 or 3 days. It's worked fine when the weather's been really good, which it's been relatively warm and dry. The problem is last night, or early this morning, it drizzled. And so a lot of this tent city got wet. And the sheets I set up to protect them from the sun got wet, and they're hanging quite low.
It was the morning of February 10th, 2013, and for most passengers aboard the Carnival Triumph, it began like any other day at sea. The sun was rising over the horizon, casting golden rays across the Gulf of Mexico. Some early risers were enjoying coffee on the deck. Others were still asleep in their cabins, wrapped in the comforting illusion that this cruise, though perhaps behind schedule, was still a luxurious getaway. Then, without warning, disaster struck. In the aft engine room, one of the ship's most critical areas, a fire broke out. The cause wasn't immediately apparent to the guests, and in fact, most didn't even know a fire had occurred at first. There was no dramatic explosion visible from the decks, no smoke curling up into the sky. But beneath their feet, deep in the mechanical guts of the ship, chaos was unfolding. The crew acted swiftly. Carnival's onboard fire suppression system, a complex network of sprinklers, alarms, and automated equipment, kicked into action. Trained emergency personnel descended into the engine area to contain the blaze. Within a relatively short time, the fire was extinguished. From a safety standpoint, that part of the crisis was handled. But putting out the flames didn't undo the damage they left behind. The fire had disabled the ship's electrical systems, the very systems that powered the engines, ventilated the cabins, kept the food cold, and critically flushed the toilets.
Attorney Frank Spagnoletti obtained the documents in his lawsuit against Carnival.
That ship never should have set sail in February. It was unseaworthy at the commencement of the voyage. These documents tell you that the company, and I'm saying to you the corporation back in Miami, had knowledge of the fact that this vessel had a propensity for fires, that there were things that could have been, should have been, and weren't done in order to make sure that fires didn't take place.
With the engines knocked offline, the ship lost all propulsion. The Carnival Triumph was no longer navigating the Gulf. It was drifting completely at the mercy of ocean currents and weather conditions. Soon, the temperature inside the ship began to climb. The air conditioning systems had gone silent. The powerful machinery that once kept every stateroom cool and breezy was now nothing more than dead metal. Below deck, where airflow was minimal, cabins quickly became stifling, humid, sticky, and oppressive. Passengers cracked open balcony doors where possible. Others simply abandoned their rooms in favor of sleeping in hallways or on the upper decks, hoping to catch a breeze under the open sky.
For passengers.
I'm not liking that.
By this time, 2 other Carnival cruise ships had been diverted to deliver food and water to the hobbled vessel. Helicopters were also deployed carrying generators and other supplies on Wednesday.
They came in, dropped off water and stuff, but that didn't stop babies from going hungry. That didn't stop other people from hoarding food.
Wow.
Refrigeration systems also went offline. The abundance of fresh and frozen food meant to feed over 4,000 people for days was suddenly at risk of spoiling. The buffet lines, once filled with gourmet options, soon turned into scenes of scarcity. Sandwiches were served on hamburger buns. Cold cuts were handed out without sides. At one point, passengers resorted to eating onions and condiments on bread, whatever could survive the rising heat and lack of refrigeration.
You did have to wait 2 to 3 hours sometimes to get food, and they would gripe at you, or other people would practically cuss you out because you would have multiples, but you're trying to get for your whole cabin, so everybody wasn't standing in line.
At first, the first couple of days, everyone was hoarding. People would take the little mini cereal boxes, piling like 20, stuffing them down their shirts, people grabbing cake with bare hands, and when they had hamburgers, they'd take about 8 piled high on a plate, and so the food situation was kind of pretty frustrating.
But what truly pushed the situation into nightmare territory was the failure of the sewage systems. The toilets stopped working, not just in a few rooms or in isolated areas, but across the entire ship. Carnival's waste management systems rely on vacuum suction and power-driven treatment stations. Without electricity, they couldn't process human waste, nor could they flush the toilets. Overflow began to back up into cabins and hallways. Crew members did what they could, using plastic bags, red biohazard bins, and portable toilets on deck. But the sheer number of people and the length of time without power made sanitation nearly impossible. Soon, passengers began referring to parts of the ship as tent cities or even biohazard zones. Some took to sleeping in the open air on poolside lounge chairs or laying out makeshift beds in stairwells. Sheets were draped from railings for privacy. Blankets were repurposed into tents. It looked less like a cruise and more like a survival camp. And yet, while passengers were enduring miserable conditions, the official messaging from Carnival remained oddly muted. Announcements referred to the problem as technical difficulties. Public relations statements emphasized passenger safety and downplayed the scope of the failure. Carnival assured everyone that they were working on the issue, that a solution was underway, that help was coming. They tried to manage the crisis from a communication standpoint, careful not to use words like catastrophic failure or emergency too freely. But for those on board, no amount of PR spin could obscure the reality. There were overflowing toilets, no working showers, minimal access to clean water, food shortages, long lines, sleeping bags on deck, soiled carpets, the stench of human waste mixing with rotting food in the hallways, the heat, the exhaustion, the feeling of being trapped, adrift in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, helpless and growing increasingly desperate. Crew members did their best under unimaginable conditions. Many worked around the clock, cleaning what they could, distributing meals, trying to keep spirits up. But morale began to erode. Tempers flared. Rumors spread rapidly about how bad the damage really was, when help would arrive, or whether the ship would even make it back. Even as Carnival arranged to tow the Triumph back to port, the timeline kept shifting. At first, the ship was supposed to be brought to Progreso, Mexico, but currents and logistics forced a change of plans. The destination was then rerouted to Mobile, Alabama, over 500 miles away. That meant more time stranded, more time without proper hygiene, more days under the punishing sun and sticky nights. Some passengers were frightened, others angry. Many were simply numb. It was difficult to grasp how quickly the cruise had unraveled, from champagne and sunsets to makeshift toilets and ration sandwiches. The suddenness of it all, the way normalcy gave way to chaos, left a lingering sense of disbelief. And yet, the worst was still ahead. With the ship now a dead hulk floating in the Gulf, its passengers at the mercy of external rescue efforts, Carnival's nightmare was just beginning to reach the public eye. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story. Helicopter footage of the Triumph showed a ship that looked fine from the outside, but inside, the reality was becoming something far more grim. The media dubbed it the Poop Cruise, and soon the entire world would be watching. Once the toilet stopped working, everything changed. It's hard to overstate the psychological impact of that moment, when passengers realized they couldn't flush. Not once, not ever. In a space built for luxury, comfort, and pleasure, that single failure was the domino that sent the entire system crumbling. The ship that had once promised paradise was now unable to provide the most basic human necessity: sanitation. With the sewage system offline, waste began backing up into showers and sinks. Cabin toilets overflowed, unable to process even a single flush. The smell, sharp, sour, inescapable, seeped into the carpets, the furniture, and eventually into the very air. As temperatures inside the ship climbed and air circulation faltered, the odor grew thicker, heavier, more oppressive. It followed passengers down the corridors, up stairwells, and onto open decks. The crew handed out red biohazard bags, asking guests to relieve themselves in these makeshift containers. In some areas, passengers resorted to urinating in showers or using towels to block sewage from flowing into their rooms. Others lined plastic bags inside trash cans, tied them off, and left them in corners of their cabins. It wasn't dignified, it wasn't safe, but it was the only option available. The corridors of the Carnival Triumph, once cleaned daily and smelling faintly of citrus disinfectant, became impromptu latrines. The term Tent City took on a literal meaning as passengers used bedsheets and blankets to create private enclosures in the hallways. Those fortunate enough to have balconies opened their sliding doors in desperation, trying to air out their staterooms. Others simply abandoned their rooms altogether. At night, the upper decks became a chaotic sprawl of sleeping bodies. Dozens, then hundreds of passengers laid out towels, cushions, and life jackets to sleep under the stars. Some built small forts with deck chairs, fashioning personal space from whatever they could find. Pillows from cabins became treasures. Passengers covered themselves with beach towels, trying to block out the chill of night or the brightness of the deck lights. And then there was the food, or the lack of it. With refrigeration systems down, the vast stores of meat, produce, and dairy began to spoil rapidly. What was once an endless buffet of options became a scramble to serve whatever could still be eaten. The crew, doing their best under impossible conditions, managed to cobble together meals from limited, perishable ingredients. Bread became scarce, so did cold cuts. Long lines stretched across decks as people waited hours for whatever was available. Some passengers reported eating nothing but ketchup and onion sandwiches. Others received cold waffles, crushed crackers, or reheated beans. Meals were handed out with no trays, no napkins, no options. Often passengers had no choice but to eat with their hands or fashion utensils from coffee stirrers and straws. For those with dietary restrictions or medical conditions, the limited options made the situation even worse. Hydration became a concern too. Bottled water ran low, ice melted. With the heat rising and shade hard to find, some people began to feel dizzy, lightheaded, even faint. Crew distributed small rations of juice and soda, but supplies were stretched thin. Some passengers began hoarding food or drinks, hiding them under deck chairs or in bags. Tensions ran high. Despite the desperate circumstances, many of the crew continued to work with astonishing resolve. With limited resources and no power, they cleaned what they could, tried to maintain order, and provided what comfort they could offer. But there were simply too many people and too few solutions. Even the most dedicated staff couldn't prevent the ship's rapid descent into squalor. Then came the cameras. As the ship floated aimlessly, cut off from civilization, but not from satellite signals, passengers began using their phones to document the unfolding nightmare. Photos showed backed-up toilets, food trays with barely edible meals, sleeping areas made from pool chairs and towels. Videos captured the smells, the filth, the frustration. One particularly haunting clip showed brown liquid oozing down walls in a hallway, an apparent sewage leak. Another showed passengers forming long, silent lines, waiting under a baking sun for bread and pickles. Social media did the rest. As passengers uploaded photos and updates, the story exploded online. Tweets were shared thousands of times. News outlets picked up the posts. Journalists began referring to the ship not by its name, but by a nickname coined by the public, the Poop Cruise.
So what was supposed to have been a simple 4-day cruise turned out to be no carnival for anyone aboard the ship. And now Carnival Cruise Lines faces a potential tidal wave of legal action.
The nickname stuck, crude yet disturbingly accurate. Cable news anchors joked about it. Late-night comedians used it as material. But for those aboard, it was anything but funny. They were living it. The filth, the heat, the hunger, the helplessness, the waiting. Some passengers tried to stay positive. Makeshift games broke out on deck. A few people led sing-alongs or shared snacks. But these moments of levity were rare. More common were tears, short tempers, arguments, and quiet despair. Children cried. Elderly passengers struggled. Parents tried to shield their kids from the reality. But how do you hide the fact that you're all sleeping next to bags of your own waste? Every hour stretched into the next with agonizing slowness. Each day without plumbing, without air conditioning, without information, chipped away at morale. By now, the world was watching. Helicopters flew overhead, capturing the surreal image of a cruise liner stranded in the blue expanse of the Gulf, gleaming white from the outside, but inside, teetering on the brink of humanitarian crisis. Carnival, under growing public pressure, rushed to organize rescue efforts. But for the people still stuck on board, relief couldn't come fast enough. They weren't passengers anymore. They were survivors. And every moment spent drifting in that floating prison became a moment burned into memory, etched with the smell of sewage, the taste of stale food, and the surreal realization that they had paid for this. As the ship floated helplessly in the Gulf of Mexico and passengers endured one indignity after another, the story of the Carnival Triumph disaster began to spread like wildfire. First came the viral tweets, then came the videos, then came the headlines. Major news outlets latched onto the unfolding drama. Terms like floating hell and sewage-soaked cruise began appearing in headlines. Cable news aired live coverage as helicopters hovered over the disabled vessel. Within hours, the Carnival Triumph wasn't just a stranded ship, it was a full-blown public relations catastrophe. The internet had crowned it the poop cruise, and Carnival had no choice but to respond. Faced with global scrutiny and growing outrage, Carnival Cruise Lines launched into damage control mode. Press releases were issued, statements were made, and company representatives appeared on television, emphasizing their concern for passenger safety and praising the heroic efforts of the crew. But corporate apologies only went so far. Passengers and their families wanted accountability and action. Carnival's first attempt at appeasement came in the form of compensation. Each passenger was offered $500 in cash, a full refund of their cruise fare, reimbursement for travel expenses, and a credit toward a future Carnival cruise. On paper, it sounded generous. In practice, many passengers found it insulting. They had endured days of unbearable conditions, raw sewage, spoiled food, heat exhaustion, and psychological trauma. People had become physically ill. Others reported panic attacks, infections, and depression in the aftermath. To offer them a voucher toward another cruise on the same line felt to many like a cruel joke. They act like this was just a minor inconvenience, one passenger told the media. But we lived through something traumatic. $500 doesn't erase that. And then came the uncomfortable revelations. Reporters and investigators began digging into the Carnival Triumph service history, and what they found was unsettling. The ship had reportedly suffered mechanical problems in the past. In fact, prior maintenance records revealed recurring issues with the propulsion system, problems that were allegedly flagged but never fully resolved. Inspections conducted before the voyage had recommended further review, yet the ship still set sail. This led to a critical question in the court of public opinion. Why was this ship allowed to leave port at all? Carnival's image, once seen as a symbol of affordable fun and adventure, began to erode. Critics accused the company of negligence. Questions swirled about whether Carnival had knowingly sent a vessel with mechanical red flags into open waters. The narrative shifted. This wasn't just an accident. It might have been preventable. Experts weighed in, pointing to a troubling pattern in the cruise industry, cost-cutting at the expense of safety. As ships grew larger and more complex, the systems that supported them became more fragile. Yet, maintenance budgets didn't always grow to match that scale. Critics argued that some cruise lines prioritized profits over preparedness, running ships hard with minimal downtime for thorough inspections. Passengers echoed these concerns. Many felt they had been treated not as guests, but as liabilities, expected to endure a disaster while the company focused more on minimizing public fallout than truly helping them. The goodwill between customer and corporation had shattered. And then came the legal storm. Within weeks, more than 100 passengers filed lawsuits against Carnival. The claims ranged from emotional distress and unsafe conditions to gross negligence and health complications linked to unsanitary environments. Law firms specializing in maritime litigation stepped in, seeking damages for everything from ruined honeymoons to children developing respiratory issues after the voyage. But Carnival had an unexpected shield: maritime law. Under international maritime regulations and the fine print written into cruise contracts, those long, unread pages of legal jargon that every guest unknowingly agrees to when booking, the cruise line's liability was limited, very limited. Passengers had waived many rights simply by boarding. These legal protections, common in the cruise industry, made it extremely difficult to win substantial damages. Carnival's lawyers cited these clauses in nearly every defense. They argued that mechanical failures, unpleasant conditions, and itinerary changes were all covered under their terms of service. As long as Carnival could prove they took reasonable action once the crisis began, they were likely in the clear. This legal reality frustrated passengers even more. The idea that a corporation could allow a poorly maintained ship to set sail, subject its guests to filth and fear, and walk away with minimal consequences. It sparked outrage, not just from passengers, but from consumer advocacy groups and lawmakers. The lawsuits dragged on, but most were either dismissed, quietly settled, or dragged into arbitration, far from the public eye. Behind the scenes, Carnival tried to salvage its image. They issued statements about reviewing safety protocols, investing in fleet-wide maintenance, and improving communication with guests during emergencies. But the damage was done. Public trust had been shaken. The Carnival Triumph incident became a case study in crisis management, or mismanagement. It highlighted the fragility of public relations in the age of smartphones and social media, where passengers could broadcast disasters in real time, and no corporate spin could silence the truth leaking out, sometimes literally from the ship's walls. The poop cruise wasn't just an embarrassment. It was a warning shot for the entire cruise industry. Failures don't stay hidden anymore. Not when thousands of passengers are carrying cameras, internet access, and the power to shape the narrative. For Carnival, the challenge was now twofold: clean up the mess and convince the world to trust them again. But that was no easy task. By the fifth day, the Carnival Triumph was more than just adrift. It had become a symbol of corporate failure, passenger endurance, and the fragility of luxury under pressure. The ship had floated powerless in the Gulf of Mexico for days, its once proud decks now cluttered with makeshift tents, red biohazard bags, and thousands of weary, sweat-drenched passengers. Hope came not in the form of an announcement or a miracle fix, but in the distant rumble of tugboats. Finally, help had arrived. Several tugboats were dispatched to reach the Triumph, but towing a massive cruise ship over hundreds of miles of open sea was no easy task. The Triumph wasn't designed to be pulled. It was built to cut through the water under its own power. With its propulsion system still dead, the process of towing it became a slow, methodical struggle, complicated by wind, currents, and navigational hazards. Initially, the plan was to pull the Triumph south to Progreso, Mexico, the nearest accessible port. But Mother Nature had other ideas. Strong currents and poor weather conditions made that route unfeasible. The plan had to be abandoned, and a new destination was chosen: Mobile, Alabama, more than 300 miles to the north. The tow began, inch by agonizing inch. The ship's average speed hovered between 2 and 4 miles per hour, a crawl by ocean standards. The journey that should have taken hours under engine power now stretched into days. Passengers, still suffering from heat, exhaustion, and worsening hygiene conditions, watched helplessly as the coastline remained a faint blur on the horizon. Communication on board was sparse. Carnival released updates, but passengers often learned more from media reports than from the PA system. Every hour spent in limbo intensified the frustration. The crew, stretched to their limits, continued to distribute food, manage makeshift latrines, and reassure passengers who had long since run out of patience. For many on board, the worst part was not the physical discomfort. It was the psychological toll. The feeling of being trapped, powerless, forgotten. A simple vacation had turned into an ordeal that blurred the lines between inconvenience and trauma. Parents tried to comfort crying children. Elderly passengers were monitored for dehydration and heat stroke. Fights broke out. Others withdrew entirely, sitting silently on the decks, staring out at the unchanging horizon. And yet, slowly, day by day, mile by mile, the Triumph was pulled toward salvation. Finally, on the night of February 14, 2013, 5 full days after the fire, the Carnival Triumph entered the port of Mobile, Alabama. The image was unforgettable. A once glorious cruise liner limping into harbor under the pull of industrial tugboats, surrounded by rescue personnel, media vans, and anxious family members.
The toilet situation was pretty bad. They told us to go in showers. The boat started tilting, so you couldn't really do that anymore because of the drain. So they told us to go in sinks, and they handed out bags for us.
The crowd on shore erupted in cheers. Passengers, many carrying backpacks and pillowcases stuffed with belongings, lined the railings and waved with exhaustion in their eyes. Disembarkation began late that night and continued into the early morning hours. Some passengers were brought off the ship on gurneys. Others stepped onto the dock and immediately broke into tears. News cameras captured scenes that seemed more like the aftermath of a natural disaster than the conclusion of a pleasure cruise. People smiled, laughed, even posed for selfies, but under it all was fatigue, relief, and a shared trauma that words couldn't quite describe. Some kissed the ground. Others vowed never to board another cruise ship again. Carnival arranged for charter buses and flights to return passengers home. In interviews, company officials repeated apologies and emphasized that the safety of their guests had always been the top priority. But for those who had lived through it, the gap between PR spin and lived experience felt too wide to bridge. The Triumph had returned, but the damage, both physical and reputational, was done. It was a journey no one aboard would ever forget, and for many, it would be the last cruise they'd ever take. The Carnival Triumph disaster may have ended at the docks in Mobile, but its ripple effects would continue for years to come. As news coverage unfolded and lawsuits mounted, it became clear that this wasn't just about a single engine fire on a single cruise ship. It was about an entire industry, one that operated in murky waters both literally and legally. Carnival's incident exposed a glaring vulnerability in modern cruising: the interdependence of systems. The engines didn't just move the ship, they powered air conditioning, refrigeration, sanitation, communications, lighting, and more. When the engine room was compromised, everything else collapsed like a house of cards. In theory, cruise ships are equipped with emergency generators. In practice, those generators were never designed to handle full operations for multiple days, let alone in tropical heat and with thousands of passengers on board. Even more concerning was the legal structure that allowed it all to happen. Carnival, like most major cruise lines, doesn't register its ships in the United States. Instead, they fly what's known as a flag of convenience. In Triumph's case, the Bahamian flag. This means the ship operates under the laws and safety standards of that country, not those of the U.S., even if it sails out of American ports and serves primarily American guests. This legal loophole provides massive financial advantages: lower labor costs, fewer regulations, reduced taxes, and looser safety requirements. But it also creates enormous gray areas when things go wrong. Passengers expecting U.S. protections found themselves instead under the authority of outdated or poorly enforced international maritime laws. Critics were quick to pounce. Congressional hearings were held. Consumer advocacy groups demanded reform. Investigative reports surfaced about a pattern of mechanical issues and underreporting of maritime incidents across the cruise industry. Former employees came forward with stories of undertrained staff, ignored maintenance warnings, and cost-saving measures that put guests at risk. And Carnival wasn't the only target. The Triumph incident shined a spotlight on an industry that had grown too fast, too big, and too deregulated. The image of luxury at sea clashed with the reality. Floating cities with minimal oversight, aging infrastructure, and profit-driven decision-making. The message was clear. This wasn't just an isolated case, it was a symptom. The Carnival Triumph didn't sink, but its story exposed a chilling truth. You don't need to go down with the ship to go through hell on the ocean. The Carnival Triumph set out to deliver sunshine and escape. Instead, it became a cautionary tale, a nightmare on the high seas that turned happy families into survivors and a billion-dollar cruise empire into a public relations disaster. Since then, changes have been promised. Safety audits, new protocols, better equipment. But in the end, one truth remains. When you step aboard a cruise ship, you're not just sailing on water, you're sailing on trust. And for many who lived through the poop cruise, that trust was flushed away. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more incredible true stories from around the world.